Hello, everyone. My name is Yitzchak Schwartz. I know I've been in touch via email with some of you, and I look forward to meeting you all. I'm the director of the Byron Sherwin Learning Center, and I want to welcome you all to our inaugural event. As many of you know, we are working to perpetuate the legacy of Byron Sherwin through preserving his archive, as well as through facilitating new writing and scholarship in the world of Jewish ideas and intellectual history. And tonight's event couldn't be more appropriate. To learn more about what we're doing, please sign up for our mailing list by emailing byron.sherwin@gmail.com. Again, that's byron.sherwin@gmail.com. And in just a minute, I'm going to introduce our guest scholar today, Rabbi Irvin Ungar, a good friend and mentor to me and a lifelong friend and collaborator of Byron Sherwin's. But first, I want to share a beautiful message from Byron's son, Jason, who couldn't be here tonight in person, but wanted to say a few words to all of you and recorded a short video that he asked me to share.
Welcome to the Rav Byron Sherwin Online Learning Center and Institute's first lecture and podcast. I'm Rabbi Sherwin's son, and I'm glad to introduce to you Yitzchak Schwartz, the first director of the Rav Byron Sherwin Learning Center, and Rabbi Irvin Ungar, a lifelong collaborator and friend of my dad's, and an expert on the work of one of the 20th century's greatest Jewish illustrators, Arthur Szyk. Passover this year, we are bringing you a special event to kick off the Learning Center's lecture and podcast series. Rabbi Ungar, or Irv, as I've known him throughout my life, undertook a project to edit and issue for publication the illustrated Haggadah of Arthur Szyk when I was just in high school. He always told me that the only person he could think of to deliver the context required to understand Szyk's visual imagery in lucid enough prose for both the scholar and the novice reader was my dad. Irv would tell me that one had to understand European history, as well as Talmud and other nuances of Jewish tradition, to truly understand Szyk's ornate illustrations. Never a pen stroke or a character added for mere ornamentation, but there for meaning to the observant viewer. My dad's lifelong mission as a teacher, as a rabbi in one of the original meanings of the word, was to communicate these complexities. And he knew that communication is by definition an experience of it is with someone else at the other end. To pass that information to the student, a channel of communication has to be found and then utilized for giving knowledge to the student. Szyk Haggadah publication with Irv, my dad used his skills in prose to tell you, the reader, what Szyk Haggadah told us, the Jewish people, about Passover. Many political currents that we as a people have navigated in our own existence, helping us understand the Hebrew in our own vernacular and guiding our eye through each beautiful illustration. The 2008 publication of the Szyk Haggadah, undertaken by my dad and Rabbi Ungar, is an insightful way to learn about and understand more deeply the Passover story, in the time in which it happened, in the time in which Szyk created his Haggadah, and in our own time today. In this interview between Irv and Yitzchak, you will learn more about how the Haggadah came into being. You will learn more about a towering figure of Jewish art in the 20th century, Arthur Szyk. Most important to me, you will learn more about the man that was my greatest teacher, my only rabbi, and whose work is the foundation of this learning center, Rabbi and Professor Byron L. Sherwin. Enjoy the dialogue with Irv tonight. Enjoy Pesach with new insight this week. Enjoy what is to come from the Rav Byron Sherwin Learning Center this year and beyond. Thank you.
Well, now it really is my pleasure and honor to introduce Rabbi Irvin Ungar. Rabbi Ungar is a former pulpit rabbi, a former bookseller, art lover and collector, and he is the world's foremost authority on the artist Arthur Szyk. one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Jewish artist of the 20th century. He has curated exhibitions of Szyk's art all over the world in major museums such as the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, the United States Holocaust Museum, the Library of Congress, and the New York Historical Society. And he has written many books and articles on the subject of Arthur Szyk, his life, his art, and his ideas. Together with Rabbi Sherwin, he put out the new luxury edition of the Szyk Haggadah in 2008. Him and Rabbi Sherwin met in the mid-1970s, and the two were friends and collaborators until Byron's death in 2015. Irvin is the leading authority in the world on Szyk's art, and I am very excited to have the opportunity tonight to talk to him about what I think he would agree is Szyk's magnum opus, the Arthur Szyk Hagadah. So, Irv, I'm so glad you're here. And this is really such a pleasure to be sitting here with you and having this discussion.
Well, all kinds of thoughts are floating through my head right now. It's, you know, from the first time I met Byron to sitting at his dining room table so often with his wife, Judy, and having a meal, going into Jason's bedroom and seeing his sports memorabilia, Judy's, just the whole span of my relationship with Byron is floating by me right now. So this is a real honor to really be here, really.
So, Irv, to start off, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Szyk Haggadah for those who aren't familiar with it and its creator, Arthur Szyk?
I'd love to, Yitz, and I'm going to share my screen, for which I have some images. Let's see. You might want to allow me to speak.
Yes, I'm going to do that right now.
All right, and then we'll be ready.
Go.
Okay, very good. Let me do this. Okay, so hopefully my images are, the first image is on screen. Let me start first with Arthur Szyk's life and then bring us to the creation of the Haggadah. And Szyk, and let me start by mentioning 3 dates. So we have a context for Szyk's life and all the things that we'll say about him in the creation of the Haggadah. Szyk was born in 1894 in Łódź, Poland, to a upper middle class textile manufacturing family. It is even said that at age 6, he was already doing drawings of the Boxer Rebellion in China. Imagine an elementary school student being concerned with political events before he even knew what politics were. So he was born in 1894, at the same time that Norman Rockwell was also born in New York City, a city that Szyk was destined to come to, and which he did immigrate to the United States and to New York City in 1940. So that's the second date I'd like people to know. And the third date is 1951, which is the year that Szyk died at age 57 in New Canaan, Connecticut. To begin, I'd like to begin in 1933. Szyk is 41-year-old at the time, and Hitler has just come to power, and the United States government decides to invite one Jew from Poland to come to the United States. Can you imagine one Jew to particularly come for the reason of exhibiting his works on freedom at the Library of Congress? And Szyk is invited and arrives in New York on a December day in 1933 with his wife Julia by his side. An exhibition of his art's already taking place at the Brooklyn Museum, and Szyk is invited to exhibit his works on freedom at the Library of Congress. And already he had begun to draw works dealing with Hitler, and where he compares Hitler to Pharaoh and Goering by his side as his assistant. So Szyk had been preoccupied already with the idea that there was a new ruler in Europe and what his intentions were. So he's invited to come.
At a time when many people dismissed, Hitler's plans as, something that could never happen and not to be taken seriously.
Well, Szyk had two passions. One was art and the other was history. Szyk knew history all too well. So for him, it was pretty clear that while Pharaoh's intent was to ultimately to annihilate the Jewish people, Szyk saw that in Hitler. And so he arrived here in New York. You're in New York. I can't say here in New York, you're in New York. I'm in California.
But I'm sure you wish you were in New York.
I'm
Okay.
with you in spirit. In any case, Szyk arrived in New York. The exhibit was going on at the Brooklyn Museum, and the two bodies of work that were primarily exhibited dealing with freedom was Washington in His Times, which celebrated the freedom of the American Revolution and Revolutionary War. 38 paintings were exhibited. These works of art ultimately were gifted by the Polish president, Moszczycki, and given in 1935 to Franklin Roosevelt. And they hung in the White House when Roosevelt gave his For Freedom speech. The other body of work that was exhibited both in Brooklyn at the Library of Congress was the Statutes of Kalisz, which are the laws of the Polish city of Kalisz in 13th century, which granted civil and religious privileges to Jews, and which Szyk illuminated in the late 1920s in Poland, because he was hopeful that Poland and the other countries of Europe would extend the same privileges to Jews as had been extended to them in the 13th century, and through and also demonstrating what Jews had contributed to Polish society. So these two bodies of work were exhibited. Szyk was presented with the George Washington Bicentennial Medal by the United States Congress for his works on behalf of humanity, after he had already been presented two medals by both Poland and France, also for his works in the service of mankind. In any case, Szyk was in the US for 7 months. He then returned to Lodz, and in 1934, is when he began to illustrate the great book of freedom in Jewish tradition, which is the Haggadah. So that between 1934 and 1936, Szyk worked on all of the paintings. In 1936, as he concluded it, he dedicated this Haggadah to King George VI of England, with the hope that the British would work towards the securing of his own people, the Jewish people in Europe. Szyk saw the Haggadah as not only an ancient narrative, but one which was unfolding in his own day, which I will address later on in terms of the messages of his Haggadah. But in any case, it was published for the first time as Szyk supervised its printing from 1937 to 1940. The war breaks out, of course, in 1939. The bombing of Britain takes place in 1940, and Szyk's Haggadah is being published. The skins, the vellum skins upon which it's published, are some of the finest in the world, and they are working on printing this book in the midst of the falling bombs in Britain. It's printed in 250 copies, and at the time, it is the most expensive new book in the entire world, selling at $500 a copy in 1940, and the Times of London saying about it that this book is worthy of being considered among the most beautiful of books ever produced by the hand of man. To follow along the chain of its production, this book is then reproduced as a popular trade edition for the first time in 1956 in Israel, with a publisher in both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's printed in 10,000 copies, which is an awful lot of books being produced for a first printing. So obviously, the publishers believed this book would be well circulated. It was so well circulated that in 1957, they published another 10,000 copies, both with this blue velvet binding, and also with a metal binding, you see on the right, and several other bindings in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s through the year 2000. Of course, I had become thoroughly interested in Arthur Szyk for quite some time, and I will address that later. But to finish off the publication history, Szyk continued to, let me just show this one image, but Szyk Haggadah continued to be published right on through 2008, and in 2011, when I set out to publish the new edition of the Szyk Haggadah with a new translation and commentary by Rabbi Sherwin, which we will address.
Irv, at the time when Szyk published the Haggadah, he was already internationally known for his art, but was this his first high-profile work of Jewish art?
The answer to that,
I know he created.
No. The answer to that is no. And when you're right, when you say Szyk was famous, I mean, he was world renowned at the time that he came to the United States in 1933, although his coming to the United States sort of sealed the deal when he became the leading anti-Nazi artist in the United States during World War II. But he was incredibly well known in France, where he lived from 1921 to 1933, and there he published several books of created several books of Jewish content that were published, including Megillat Esther, the Book of Esther, which was published in 1925. He had also illustrated Song of Songs earlier, Shir HaShirim, and even books of Jewish caricatures, The Jew That Laughs, Juif Kari. So he was immersed in Jewish images. And in fact, one thing which usually doesn't come up in my talks about Szyk's Haggadah in any detail, and I won't go into much detail here, is that Szyk in the 1920s, before he illustrated the Washington and his Times portfolio and the Statutes of College portfolio, both dealing with freedom that I showed earlier, he had also begun in the mid-1920s to illustrate the Passover Haggadah for the first time. And in his 1927 diary, he indicated that he had finished that Haggadah. I've discovered original artwork from it, but it was never published. And so the idea of the Haggadah was always on his mind, really from his earliest days. He returned to it after he saw that it was even more clear that he had to deal with freedom and slavery and oppression in his own day, that he returned to it in the 1930s. So thanks for that question. But, from the very beginning, Szyk was creating images and books and works dealing with Jewish themes.
Well, I've said this to you before, but I think that your next project is the publication of the original Haggadah drawings, which I love. But that's a whole nother conversation.
Okay.
So how did you become interested in studying and collecting Arthur Szyk's art to the point where you've become you mentioned that you became interested in Szyk's art about 25 years ago, and at this point you are the expert on Szyk. How did that happen?
Well, it's actually longer than 25. It's as long as I've been married, actually, which is much longer than 25 years. I know I look like a young fellow, but it's much longer, and I will tell you when. It turns out that when I needed gifts for people in my wedding party, which was back in 1975, I walked into a bookstore, the largest Judaica bookstore in the world, which was Charlie Block's, Block Publishing, on the West Side, I think in the 1920s. And I walked in there and I saw on the table these books with this blue velvet binding, which you're seeing here on the left. And these were reproductions of Szyk's Haggadah from 1956 or 57 printings. I don't remember which. And they were about $18 at the time. I bought maybe a half dozen or a dozen of them to give as gifts. that's my first recollection of meeting Szyk's art, although family members tell me that his visual history of Israel was on a music box that used to hang in my mother's house. I don't really remember that. But that was my first meeting of Arthur Szyk. And then that the 75 is when I, became 74. I became a pulpit rabbi. I was a rabbi in both Forest Hills and Burlingame, California for 13 years, and really didn't think about Arthur Szyk during that time. I like to, as a kid, I mentioned this several times that, not only did I not think about Arthur Szyk, but as a pulpit rabbi, I never really had much time to think at all. I mean, that was so, but in any case, after I left the rabbinate and I entered the rare book world, I was in Pittsburgh, and it wasn't something I planned for, but that's another story how that happened. I was in Pittsburgh. I was visiting an antique shop. It's where my wife's family is from. I kicked a box underneath the table, and up popped a lot of Arthur Szyk's Jewish holiday prints of of Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, Simchat Torah, Pesach, Shavuot, so on. And I purchased them. And this was my second exposure to Szyk, from the Haggadah to this and religious art. And I really was drawn into it. I just loved it so much that I decided to frame these prints that I bought, put them on and sold them at antiquarian book shows that I was doing. And then quickly I noticed the publication of a book called The New Order, which was Szyk's anti-Nazi art. And I was then convinced that this was art of someone special. I really didn't have an art background, but I knew this was great art. We could talk about what does great art mean. Maybe that's another conversation. But here was an artist who was creating religious art, but political art at the same time. And I think it must have been Byron who educated me. I'm sure it was when, I was taught that the book, and probably was Heschel, Byron's mentor, who basically says that the Bible is not simply a religious book, it's a political book. What could be more important than the issues dealing with justice and freedom and taking a stance against bigotry and racism, let's add that, and all of those components. So here was Arthur Szyk, whose art was steeped in Jewish tradition, yet had a political message to deliver. And so that's what my initial contact was with Szyk.
And how did you meet Byron Sherwin?
Okay. By the way, I will also say that the more I told people about Arthur Szyk and the more people didn't know about who he was, the more it drove me forward. But there was one person who knew who Arthur Szyk was, and that was Byron Sherwin. And when I first met him, I didn't know that he knew about Szyk because I really didn't know much about Arthur Szyk, even though, I was in Forest Hills as a rabbi and Szyk had created that great arc at the Forest Hills Jewish Center in Queens.
The greatest work of synagogue art, I am convinced, in America.
Wow. I didn't, come to that. I know you've studied architecture, Jewish architecture. So, when you say something, I'm listening to that. I would say the first time I met Byron was in the 70s. I would attend what were called the CAGE conference, the Conference on Alternatives in Jewish Education. And I went, there were hundreds of lecturers. I don't know, it seemed like hundreds of lecturers. I couldn't decide who to go to. A friend of mine said, you should try out one of these talks that's given by Rabbi Byron Sherwin. I went to Byron's talk, and every subsequent year, I just took that thick book that was given. I circled Byron's name on every talk he was giving, and I built my schedule around his talks. I continued to continue my relationship with him from the 1970s onward until one day, throughout my rabbinate, we stayed friends. I invited Byron on several occasions to come and serve as a scholar in residence, to speak primarily on Heschel here in California. And we kept in touch until one day I became convinced that Arthur Szyk needed to be made famous in the world. And it was that, and I thought that the way to do that was to try to find a museum, a prominent Jewish museum, that would agree to exhibit Szyk's art. Hence, Byron, who was the intellectual head of the Spertus Institute and who oversaw its Spertus Museum, seemed to me to be the logical person to call. So I picked up the phone, and sometime in 97, thereabouts. I called Byron on the phone. I said, Byron, how you doing? What's new? So when I said to him, have you ever heard of Arthur Szyk? It's the first time I asked him that question. He said, Irv, well, when I was a teenager, I actually grew up around the Forest Hills Jewish Center. I sat in front of its ark many times, and I thought, wow, I'm really onto something now. And then I said to Byron, what do you think about an Arthur Szyk exhibition at the Spertus Museum? And Byron said to me, Irv, it's awfully cold in Chicago. You sure you want to do that? And I said, he said, but it's a good idea, but thanks for calling. And that was the end of that. And I thought that Byron had given me the cold shoulder, and that was it. I called him 3 months later. Byron, by the way, how you doing? How's Jason doing? Is there sports memorabilia still in his room? Irv, Jason's fine. Thanks a lot for calling. And that was the end of our conversation until 3 months later or 2 months later, I get a phone call from Byron. And Byron says to me, hey, Irv, what do you think about the idea of a Szyk exhibition in Chicago? Would you curate the show? I didn't even know what the word curator meant, quite frankly, but that was the beginning. Had it not been for Byron, that first show wouldn't happen. And that led to the idea that a book about Arthur Szyk needed to be created. There were no books in the English language. There were no illustrated books of Szyk that had been created. There was only one publication in Yiddish from 1980. And because of Byron, the first illustrated book about Arthur Szyk was published called Justice Illuminated, The Art of Arthur Szyk, which is a book that I created and compiled. And Byron made sure that it was published, and we were off and running. And that was my introduction to Byron, and how we met, and how we first collaborated.
So you after
and by the way, this is the book, and there's me and Byron. Yeah, that's how I look today, even though it's 25 years ago, by the way.
That's a great picture.
And yes, there's one other thing I forgot to mention, and that is that one of the other ways of bringing Arthur Szyk to the world was my taking over the Arthur Szyk Society, a not-for-profit organization that had been started by actually someone else in Southern California, George Gooch, who I got to know. And we raised the money, ultimately when I became responsible for the Szyk Society with its new board, raised the money to create a traveling exhibition, which traveled throughout the United States and to Poland over a 12, 15-year period. And it was Byron who actually wrote the study guide for that traveling exhibition, and which was divided into 3 themes. It was 32 panels, and Byron was the one who identified the images, and he wrote the short text for them, as well as this study guide. From it, I learned a tremendous amount, but it was his take on who Szyk was. And here you can see what some of his introductory words were to that. But that continued through the early 2000s, my relationship with him and the things that were created.
So how do you go from there? So you leave the rabbinate and begin working in as a rare book dealer. You come across Arthur Szyk, and you put on this exhibition. How did you decide to recreate Szyk's Haggadah?
The way that happened actually wasn't my idea, actually. It turns out that I was giving a talk. My first public talk ever about Arthur Szyk was in 1994 at Hebrew University. By the way, as an aside, I shall mention that at that talk, just because there's some hand that guides something, and I'll leave this mystical stuff for the audience, but how could you not mention mysticism when Byron was so deeply and so intellectually and so profound in bringing Jewish mysticism really down to earth for us. So how could I not mention something mystical? It was my first talk in Jerusalem. In the middle of that, I said, Szyk was born on June 3rd, 1894. By the way, I know that Wikipedia says June 16th because there's a discrepancy, although I have enough documents where Szyk himself says it was June 3rd, but it's hard to change that in Wikipedia. But I said that Szyk was born on June 3rd, 1894. And I really didn't realize to that very moment that this first talk I was giving about Szyk in the city that he loved, Yerushalayim, that was the 100th anniversary to the very day of Szyk's birth.
Wow.
And after the talk, by the way, I was in the courtyard, and to me, one of the most respected artists whom I've met in the past several decades is a fellow named David Moss in Jerusalem, responsible for the Moss Haggadah, the Stender, and other great creative art. And David said to me, "Hey, Irv, this was 1994. Have you ever thought about reproducing the Szyk Haggadah?" And I said, "No, David, tell you the truth, I've never thought about it. I've never seen the original art itself." Well, what happened was I went on to curate this exhibition in Chicago. I got to know in 1998, I got to see the original art, which was owned by Dick Janger in Chicago. He loaned it to that exhibit. I curated another exhibit at the United States Holocaust Museum in 2002. We had the Szyk art there again, and I got to examine it again. I became very familiar with it until 2006, thereabout. I asked Dick if he ever planned to sell the Szyk Haggadah. What did he plan to do with it? He said that he didn't really want to keep it. He wasn't sure that it should stay in the family. In any case, I represented him in the sale of all the original paintings of the Haggadah, and at the time thought about the idea that this is the perfect opportunity to begin to think about reproducing the Haggadah. And the reason for undertaking it was because David had said to me, if you've ever seen that original art, Irv, you'll realize that in all of Szyk's illustrated books, and he illustrated close to 30, the artwork never comes out like the original art. And so I set out to do that. I found someone to help me coordinate this project, and set out to try to produce a book where the art in this book would look as close to the original art as possible. And that was done ultimately when it was published in 2008. Were produced by inkjet, by digital printing. We could produce up to one book a day. It's a slow process and costly, but I was going to produce this limited edition. At that moment, it was also necessary to produce a new translation and commentary. And as Jason mentioned in his introduction, ultimately I went to Byron because Byron was the only person in the world who can do this. And the reason I say that is because there needed to be someone who had a mastery of Bible and Talmud and Midrash, a mastery, and also had to know Jewish history inside and out, and also had to know Polish history specifically because Szyk was from Poland and what was going on. Also, because Szyk had passages in the Haggadah that were mystical, that were never translated by Cecil Roth. It was just something he would not do. And it needed this new translation because Roth was a little bit too Victorian. He never really connected the dots. It really needed to be made understandable in our terms, in our language. And the final components were, I needed to find a person who knew who Arthur Szyk was, who understood who Szyk was. And that person needed to be a master educator, not just an educator, but a master educator. Byron was the only person in the world that could do that. And this became so important to me because I wanted Szyk's legacy to live on, and it needed to be done through the Haggadah, also through other artwork, but primarily through his magnum opus. And it needed to have the intellectual and educational level to match the level of the art. Byron was the only person who could do it. And to me, over the years, that's become even more important because while Byron's legacy will continue because of his great writings, his profound thinking, and and the people and the students who've had the connection, the personal connection with both him in the classroom and listening to his lectures and through his books, people who've met him through his books, it just seemed to me that this was also another way of Byron's legacy being perpetuated, always being tied in addition to his own creativity, but also to Szyk. To me, this has taken that dimension to the level that has, enhanced my own being and and my journey with Szyk. So that's sort of how it brings it up. And in 2008, that was published. Byron's commentary around the side of the deluxe and premier limited editions is like a commentary on the page of the Talmud. That's how it's set up, with a commentary along the side. While the 2011 edition for Abrams has a whole section of commentary, which, by the way, I have to say, I once owned 1,500. Yes, I don't know how many hours we have here. I know it's only an hour or something, but if I once published a collector's Haggadah catalog, I once owned 1,500 different Haggadot. And by the way, to write a description about 1,500 different Haggadot when they're all called Haggadah Shel Pesach is a real problem. Never again. But I had seen a lot of English translations, so I knew when we'd find the right one. I mean, I looked at everybody's, everyone from, with great translations, of text, but Byron was the best. And so I set out, and in 2008 published this luxury edition.
So I will say, Cecil Roth, who you mentioned, the original translator of in the original edition of Szyk Haggadah, he is I would say the founder of the modern field of Jewish art history, and brilliant man, and those are big shoes for anyone to fill. But having read both commentaries, I mean, Byron's commentary does something very different. It's much more engaged with the Haggadah sort of as a living text, rather than solely as an object of study. I can imagine that there would have been very few people that you could have found to step into those shoes and create a new commentary for the Szyk Haggadah. So we have, I think that we should probably start taking participant questions in about 10 minutes, but there's a couple more questions that I want to ask you, Irv, before we do that. And this sort of relates to the way that Byron structured his commentary, because you referred earlier to Szyk's illustrations of the Haggadah as visual commentary. So how would you characterize the way that Byron incorporated both the text of the Haggadah and Szyk's visual commentary into his own written commentary?
All right. Well, not sure how these questions are going to come out. I prepared some images here, so let me pop the first one here. This is from the deluxe edition from 2008, different layout from the English page, from the 2008 popular trade edition. By the way, there's a big difference in price here. It's from $8,800 on this to $18 for the popular trade edition. But anybody wants to phone me and order 6 or 7 of these, I'm happy to take the call, no problem. But this is Byron. This is
actually, Irv, someone did ask in the chat,
yes,
if there are any copies available to sell, and I want to let you all know that you can buy a copy of the 2011 popular edition of the Szyk Haggadah with Rabbi Byron Sherwin's commentary on Amazon.com, and I believe it's eligible for Prime. And you can even get it before Passover if you want. And in fact, I'm going to put a link in the chat so you can all find it easily if you want to. But I'm sorry, Irv, go ahead.
So I'd like to address, this is while people are still searching their house for leaven before Passover, not only did I think it appropriate to show this image, but also this is the page on which Byron asks the question, why is the Szyk Haggadah different from all other Haggadot? And here he answered the question because an early reviewer's, the words of an early reviewer still ring true. This is from the Times of London, and which it said that the Szyk Haggadah, it is worthy to be placed among the most beautiful of books that the hand of man has produced. And in that sense, it gives us part of the answer. It calls attention to the artwork itself. What helps to make Szyk's artwork, Szyk's Haggadah, particularly unique is the power of the messages that appear in the Haggadah. And I think that when one reads the text and or looks at the images and reads Byron's commentary, to try to keep in mind, if one can, to try to almost hold the art and its messages in the same thought at the same time. I think I remember Heschel saying that you should try to hold God and man in the same thought at the same time, but that probably came from Byron. But in any case, the second element of this is the messages that are in Szyk's art. And that's what Byron helps to explain and to translate in his commentary, both in this edition and in the popular edition. Let's take a look at a couple of the messages. First of all, let's look at the message that for Szyk, he saw the Nazis as the new Egyptians. He saw Hitler as the new Pharaoh and the Nazis as new Egyptians. And that was an emphasis in his Haggadah, pointing out oppression, pointing out where it came from, and that this was a Haggadah for his own time. The second aspect that makes his Haggadah particularly important given its timing is the emphasis on Jewish heroism. So two images on the Nazis as new Egyptians. Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Szyk paints the Egyptian with blonde hair and blue eyes, and this roundel on his chest was painted over prior to publication. But on the right, you see a swastika that was uncovered beneath the layers of paint as a result of a museum exhibition, and they're examining this art, which I had learned about from someone who had seen Szyk's Haggadah as a child back in Lvov in Poland and had told me about it, and the Holocaust Museum was able to show it. But this was one of the emphasis in his Haggadah. These swastikas were painted over. And also on the four questions in the Haggadah, you saw Szyk painted swastikas on snakes, and here the snake in the upper right-hand corner is about to attack the freedom of the Israelites. With its mouth wide open, Szyk painted swastikas. Those were the Nazis who were attacking not the first freedom marchers but the Israelites, the Jews in his own time. And here through a lithographic print that was uncovered from 1935, we see the swastikas here. I'm going to talk real quick and move beyond because I really want to get to other people's questions. But one image dealing with heroism, and there are numerous images throughout the Haggadah. I've chosen this one, which has a verse from the book of Psalms running with the orange background across the bottom of pursuing the aggressors and God being one's deliverance. But for Szyk, it's important to put humans involved in helping bring about redemption for the Jewish people. And when you look at this image, there's a chariot and there's someone who's dead underneath the horses in the bottom left. And you think of the story of the Exodus from ancient Egypt. Of course, it's the Egyptians in the chariot and it's the Israelites who are fallen, but not for Arthur Szyk. You see, what he does, he paints the ancient Hebrews in the chariot. Look, if you look at the Star of David, that is above the wheel here. And if you look at the blue and white banner, which ultimately became the colors of the Israeli flag, these are the ancient Hebrews. And because of this verse from the book of Psalms, this can be ascribed to being David, who is in the chariot. David's not at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. He's a couple hundred years earlier, thereabouts. But what he does is Szyk puts the fallen enemy of Israel over here. Above that is the vulture of Rome and of the Nazi Empire, where the dove of peace, however, is over here. Byron's commentary helps make this kind of interpretation possible as we look through the Haggadah itself. And you can read those commentaries throughout. But I hope this helps set off the context in which the Haggadah is being published and how Szyk is moving history, moving from one part of history and making it meaningful in our own time.
And Byron, in his commentary, talks about how to Szyk, in order to achieve redemption, the Jewish people can't simply wait on a miracle, and they can't take it all in their own hands, but that there needs to be this in between approach of the Jewish people themselves taking steps to redeem themselves from oppression and bring about retribution on their enemies, and also, a fusion of that and divine intervention. So how does Szyk navigate that vision of redemption?
All right, because we really need more time, obviously, because there's a lot to say. I'm going to skip some images. I'm going to move to this concept of redemption. This is the front cover of the 2011 publication. I want to move to Byron's text here. Szyk's illustrations articulate his lifelong preoccupation, not only with history, but with what historical memory has to say about contemporary events. That's a major emphasis in what he has to say. And this image is a good example of it, which is the image of, in each and every generation, there are those who rise up against us to annihilate us. And on the right here, you see many of the nations throughout history who attempted to annihilate the Jewish people. We don't have time to explicate this because I want to go to the concept of redemption, which was too important from Byron to ignore, for me to ignore, and your particular question. So here are the two aspects of redemption. What Byron tries to point out and to make it clear in the Haggadah is the idea of collective redemption, that is the redemption of a people as a whole, and also the idea of spiritual redemption, also not only of a people, but of the individual, him or herself. And he discusses this concept of redemption and uses Szyk's artwork to help explain what the Haggadah is trying to do. And so that, for example, while you will have this beautiful cup of Elijah coming is a really spiritual event to our table, to everyone's table, as it comes to a bris, he comes to our Passover meals, and brings this concept of redemption, hopefully ushering in a better world, a spiritual world. See, Szyk uses great beauty for this cup of Elijah, but at the same time, he puts an image in the very center of Elijah rebuking the wicked Ahab. This has nothing to do with Passover. It's the redemptive element, but yet redemption has to come through physical redemption. Jews need to physically be involved in the redemption of their own people in the mid-1930s when Szyk is creating the artwork. So through one image, Szyk is attempting to do both. Byron is helping us to understand that. The same thing with the image on the far right, where Moses' name is not mentioned in the Haggadah, except for one small piyut, but not in the entire discussion about the meaning of Passover. Szyk puts Moses back in the Haggadah. And there's a great quote about that Byron has made about Moses and David and what they represent to the Haggadah. I may have a chance to show that. But here, Moses is the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, and he, according to Szyk, must be integrated into that Haggadah narrative. And so he uses his portrait several times, presiding over the Egyptians drowning in the sea, striking the Egyptian taskmaster. Here he portrays Moses as a bodybuilder, very strong, very muscular. And this is the military aspect of that Szyk wants to represent, that military aspect. When his arms are raised, the Israelites are victorious in battle over the Amalekites. Szyk wants the Jews to be heroic, to be victorious, to be involved in their physical redemption. But Szyk takes a religious figure of Moses and combines that aspect with the idea of the involvement in the physical redemption of the people, and of that each of the people themselves must become heroic in order for that to come about. And so these are some of the elements. And of course, Moses and David play a role in this. And hopefully we can finish with this last slide or two to address, I think, what needs to be stated here, and that is the following, which falls, I think, on the question about redemption. And that has to do with the idea of outer strength and inner strength. And the outer strength can be represented by the figures of Moses and David. And Byron writes in the commentary, for Szyk Haggadah, justice and retribution will ultimately prevail. He sees Jewish militancy and activism, of which David and Moses are paradigmatic models, the primary vehicles for meting out justice to the foes of the people of Israel. And here you see two of the images which deal with not only the redemption, but how Szyk is using these figures and how Byron is helping us understand what's really going on in the Haggadah. The inner strength comes on the very opposite end. And on this image, which is in the very beginning of the Haggadah, this is the order of the Seder. And what I'd like to point out is the Hebrew text that is at the very bottom, which is next to the man who's holding the Kiddush cup. Byron's translation of this is, behold, I am ready and prepared to fulfill the commandment of drinking the first of the 4 cups of wine, for the sake of unifying the Blessed Holy One with his Shekhinah, the male and female aspects of divinity, which is hidden and mysterious in the name of all Israel. This is Byron's translation. Cecil Roth did not translate this passage when it appears here, and I think 3 or 4 other places in the Haggadah, which is, these are kavanot, these are intentions. These are words that are to be recited before one performs a mitzvah. For Byron, this was absolutely clear. It as if it flashed before him. You know, Byron can write about the militancy of David and Moses, pointing out what Szyk is attempting to do. But Byron was the person also to bring forth this gentle, reflective, spiritual, conscious aspect of the Haggadah narrative. Szyk put it here. You know, he used a 20th century text, Haggadah text, that would have been used by Jews in Poland in the early 20th century to be his text that he created his calligraphy and his text around. But it is Byron's commentary, and I guess I've said this 100 times, and why not? I'll say it 101. It's better to say it 101 than 100. That it is between these worlds of a militant Szyk in the 1930s who felt that the Jews needed to rise up to meet their oppressors, and it is that reflective, introspective, spiritual heights that we can individually achieve that Byron infuses Szyk's Haggadah with. And it is with this image I'd like to conclude my answers to your questions. It's if there's others, I'd love to take them.
Okay, we have our first question. This is a really interesting one. It's from Alicia, and the question is, what is your favorite page of the Haggadah and why?
Oh my God.
To,
Oh
to,
my
to the man
God.
who spent more time, studying and looking at these pages.
You know, I would say my favorite page is the King George dedication page. You know, where he decides to, where Szyk dedicates it to, you know, to His Gracious Majesty. I humbly lay these works of my hands, showing forth the afflictions of my people Israel. Where this is the first page of the Haggadah to George VI. He becomes king in 1936, just as Szyk is finishing all the artwork in Lodz, Poland, and because he wants England to be at the forefront of fighting the Nazis. And turns out that Szyk's also aware that England had passed a series of white papers that prevented that the British had passed to prevent the Jews from leaving Europe and entering the land of Israel. And the question was, how could Szyk dedicate this book to a king and to a people who were restricting the flow of the Jews out of Europe? And that's where the genius of Szyk comes in, because he has to be honest about how he dedicated a book of freedom to people who are restricting the freedom of your people. And that's where he paints European Jews who need to have an exodus from Europe in the bottom right of the page. Instead of the ancient Israelites, you need to have an Exodus, he paints European Jews. And on the gates entering into Jerusalem, on the bottom left, he paints the word Sion. On the castle gates, Jews need to get from Europe to Sion. King George, on your page, I'm painting this. And not only does Szyk do that, but in the center of the Jews leaving Europe and going to Zion, he paints a British military ship right in the middle of that. And that is given to the king. That the king gets the first copy, by the way. And that's my favorite page. It's speaking truth to power, baby. That's how this book opens up. These are the layers that Szyk is doing. This is a political book for Szyk. It's about Jewish survivor. And that's I didn't show that image, but hopefully maybe, I'm helping you visualize it. You'll look at by the way, I should tell you, the 1956 printing, the 60s, the 80s, the 90s don't have that dedication page. It's produced in Israel. They weren't interested in the British in the 50s. King George was out. So we, in our publication, we put that King George dedication page that was in the 1940 edition. We put it back because that's so important to telling the story of that. And this is a long answer to your question, but you got me excited by asking me about my most favorite page. By the way, I once had a letter that the king's librarian wrote to the publisher of the Szyk Haggadah about the king's reaction to this. And what the king wrote, what the librarian wrote, is that the king for 2 weeks, for a fortnight, kept the Szyk Haggadah, the first copy in vellum, kept it for 2 weeks at Windsor Castle. He showed it to everybody who came by because he was so proud of it. But no mention about what Szyk had done at the bottom. By the way, that dedication page had words painted over in the bottom, I should add, that have never been written about, which I hope to do at some point. Well, actually, maybe I have. The words were unaddressed and unavenged, which appeared below that dedication. At the feet of your most gracious majesty, I humbly lay these works of my hands, shewing forth the afflictions of my people, unaddressed and unavenged. Wow. Those were Szyk's words in the beginning, but he painted over them.
It occurred to me while you were saying this that in a lot of medieval and early Renaissance, before the printing press, illuminated Haggadot, there's a picture, a depiction of the gates of Zion on the last page. And it's sort of this hope for future redemption. When we say at the end of the Seder,
right,
next year in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Szyk is sort of taking that, along the lines of this idea of active redemption, and he's taking the gates of Zion and putting it right on the front page.
Now, not only that, there is one little vignette frontispiece before that King George dedication page, which it's the first page, the real first page, and the first sentence on that first page happens to be Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Now, for Szyk, if his right hand withers, he can't paint, he can't create. So it was a personal message, and it was about Jerusalem at the forefront. And do you know what the last sentence is on the last page in Szyk's Haggadah? It's the same thing. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. What that tells us is that from beginning to end, Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, was placed in Szyk's hand and in his heart. This is how he communicated. I mean, the layers upon layers of meaning in this Haggadah are off the charts. And keep in mind, these layers and layers of meaning with great art, hand in hand. I mean, I guess I'm getting a little excited now, Yitz, but.
No. I mean, it's incredible. That's what great art does. It, arouses our emotions and ideas and passions, and that's what Szyk certainly does. Now, this is a question from Susan, and she wants to know if you could tell the story of Mark Twain and Szyk.
Well, yes, I could. There is an image. I'm sure Twain never saw Szyk's Haggadah. I'm not sure the year Twain died, but if he had, then it would have caused him to write the essay concerning the Jew, because in one image of God's promise, which I flipped through and didn't really show, where it talks about in each and every generation there are those who rise against us to annihilate us, and Szyk does in that one picture sort of a trash heap of Jewish history, where the trash heap is all the nations that rose up against the Jewish people and never succeeded to annihilate them: the Greeks, the Romans, the Spanish Inquisition, the pogroms in Russia. And Szyk puts all that in one image. It's the same thing that Twain writes in 1899 in Harper's magazine about, that all these nations will come and go in their great dim puff in history, but still the Jew survives. And what is the secret of the Jew's immortality? What is it? I think Szyk in that work of art answered that all these nations have gone the way of the world and the Jew has continued to survive. I think Szyk answers that question in that particular work of art, because if you look at it, what you'll see presiding at the top is that there is a Jew who's holding the Kiddush cup to celebrate life, and right next to him is Szyk paints the 10 commandments almost presiding over this whole image, as if to say God's moral law and the intellectual challenge that those moral laws represent, that the Jews' constant adherence to it and wrestling with it throughout the centuries is at the core, or one of the components that has ensured the Jews' longevity. So, Mr. Twain, I would suggest that when you come back again, as many righteous Jews and the righteous among the nations come back again, who are no longer with us, they should relook at Szyk's artwork. But we who are in the land of the living, we can look at it now. So we don't have to wait. But that is in that. Thanks for the question, Susan.
Now, here's another a comment more than a question, that Michelangelo also, in his famous sculpture of Moses with the horns in
Yes.
The Basilica of St. Peter in Rome,
Yes.
portrays Moses as this physically imposing.
Yes.
And and I don't have the name of this of the person who asked this question, so I'm sure Szyk was very familiar with that.
Oh yeah, no. Several of the images of Moses have these rays of light coming from one's head, and not only was Szyk be familiar with that, these were rays of light, not horns, but the word Karen can be rays of light and rays and horns. So depends on the translation that one applies to that. But Szyk also has an image of Michelangelo's Twilight and Dawn that Szyk knew about. And if you look in the beginning of the Haggadah, if you look at the Star of David, which is the Seder plate, resting on top are two figures in relaxed pose, while in the center of the Seder plate, there's a taskmaster striking a Israelite slave. And these two figures are resting on that Star of David, are reminiscent of Michelangelo's Twilight and Dawn. And we owe thanks to Professor Shalom Sabar of Hebrew University, who in his commentary, Freedom Illuminated, Understanding the Szyk Haggadah, writes about this. So thanks to Shalom for pointing that out. But Szyk was familiar. He would have been familiar with, he worked in the Renaissance, in illuminated manuscript technique. So being familiar with the Renaissance painters and with their style and with their meanings would have been second nature to him.
Now, if anyone else has questions, please do put them into the chat. Here we have another comment from Susan, about the visual history of Israel, Szyk's visual history of Israel. I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but just
let me twist the question. Can I take prerogative to twist the question?
Sure, please.
What I will do is, rather than focus on the visual history of Israel piece that Szyk did, let me just point out that his Haggadah is filled with Zionism motifs. Let me just draw us back to the Haggadah and say that you will find images of the grandfather who's blessing his grandchildren, hoping they will go off to the land of Israel in 1935. at the time of the Nuremberg laws, Szyk is pointing this out in the Haggadah. You will also see images, as we've shown, of the blue and white banner. You'll find warriors in the Haggadah holding the blue and white banner, not only the one that I showed you with David in the chariot. And numerous times as Szyk called, in the King George dedication page, you see the word Sion appearing there, one of many. So the idea of, Szyk's being interested that the homeland of the Jews was for them, particularly in the 1930s, how important it was, and maybe there's another lecture to be delivered on Arthur Szyk as the artist who created more art to help bring about the state of Israel than any artist, and I'm prepared to do that. Maybe on an anniversary year, we'll come back to that. But nonetheless, let's use Susan's comments to segue to the Haggadah and its Zionist motifs.
Well, now here's another comment. The lore is that Twain's son-in-law was Jewish and was an impetus to Twain writing his article about the Jews. I didn't know that. Now, if there are no more questions, then I suppose we ought to wrap up. But I want to end off with asking you a short question, Irv, and that is, if you have to say in a sentence, what is Szyk's message for us here 2 days before Passover, today in 2021? What do you think is Szyk's message for us?
Well, yeah, I think that if one looks at, I hadn't thought about this before yet, but if one wants to consider what is Szyk attempting to do in his art, it's constantly, not in every work of art, but the theme runs throughout. He always worked to elevate the prestige of the Jew in the world. He always felt that it was important for a Jew to be proud, to embrace his or her heritage, and to realize that comes at a price. It comes at that freedom to do that really means that we must always be vigilant. We must always be willing to be, not only be proud of who we are, but to stand up for who we are as a people. And I think that particularly in this day and age, we should let Arthur Szyk's art inspire us to embrace a gift that as Jews, that Jews have been given. But Szyk also simultaneously spoke about the gift that all humanity, that each person, whether Jew or Gentile, is given, that each of us must use the best of our tradition, as Szyk did, to help make the world a better place. I think what he's attempting to say is embrace who you are as a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, and use the best of that tradition to make the world a better place. And I think what we will come out of that is saying that not only is there greatness in Szyk's art and there's greatness in Szyk's message, but there is greatness in the man himself. And we should allow him, his art, Byron's serving as our master teacher along the way to guide us and to allow that to inspire us in our own day. But I think pride and the willingness to care about this gift we've been given and how we can perpetuate it from generation to generation. So I think that would be what Szyk would hope.